The highly anticipated Scott Pilgrim Takes Off anime has finally released on Netflix, and oh boy is it causing a stir, for understandable reasons. I'm just gonna go ahead and immediately say that this is about to have hella spoilers. I don't think there's any way to talk about this thing without spoiling the story massively, so go watch it if you haven't, and if you have, let's take off. The hook of Scott Pilgrim Takes Off is a massive subversion of the original story, which is definitely rubbing some people the wrong way. This series was basically advertised as a faithful retelling of the graphic novels, only for that to be upended by the end of the very first episode, when Scott is seemingly defeated by Ramona's first evil ex-boyfriend, Matthew Patel, instead of defeating him as seen in the book and movie. A ridiculously bold move that, in my opinion, pays off obscenely well. Because while this is definitely a subversion of the existing narrative, it also ends up being a total celebration of that narrative. Instead of a retelling of a story that we've already gotten, we're basically delivered a sequel to that story that unpacks so many aspects of those narratives from entirely new angles. And the truth is, we wouldn't have gotten new Scott Pilgrim content at all, ever, if this wasn't the approach, because creator Brian Lee O'Malley wasn't interested in simply retelling the same story again, which I think shows a ton of integrity on his part. In fact, it wasn't until he was having dinner with co-writer Ben David Grabinski that he found any interest in revisiting the property. Grabinski said this in his Rolling Stone interview: "We had a long talk about those things he was feeling, about not wanting to redo it. We talked about thematic reasons to revisit it, like spending more time with Ramona or more time with the exes, and at some point I blurted out, kind of as a joke, what if you just have Scott seemingly die at the end of the first fight with Matthew Patel? And then what if you made a movie about Scott Pilgrim starring Lucas Lee?" Right after I said that, Brian immediately sparked to it. And honestly, going into Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, I was starting to get a little concerned. For one, the season was only 8 episodes long, and yet seemed to feature every evil ex, implying that they were once again about to give us an abridged retelling of the graphic novels, instead of a multi-season detailed retelling. I was also very iffy about the decision to use the entire movie cast, given that the project would just immediately be even more directly compared to the very popular movie version. It felt like maybe this should just exist in its own space. But once it became clear that this story was giving us something new, those decisions made so much more sense, especially because I think this show absolutely works best if you are familiar with the books and or movie. I know Grabinski has said that it's meant to work separate of the previous versions, but personally, I think it really stands on the shoulders of the previous versions, which is why reusing the film cast actually elevates this version rather than distracts. Being somewhat familiar with the characters and even with these actors' performances of those characters makes this one so much more rewarding. And they sort of call this idea out in one of the only pieces of significantly altered dialogue in the opening episode, when Scott tells Ramona about the two drastically different versions of Sonic from the 90s.
And the same guy played Sonic in both shows. Isn't that wild? The same guy playing two different versions of the same guy?
In fact, this line sort of sets up the entire narrative here, as does Ramona's response.
I mostly watched older stuff when I was a kid. You know, Columbo reruns.
Ultimately, this series is embracing the fact that these are new explorations of the same characters and themes. It's the same actors playing two different versions of the same characters. So it almost had to be the entire movie cast reprising their roles. It really hammers this idea home. Plus, the way these characters are re-explored in this alternate timeline are through Ramona's investigation, hence the Columbo nod. Also, Columbo rips, you should watch it. I have never been happier with the series' decision to take a huge swing like this one does. It's the antidote to the biggest issues with modern reboot culture. I thought I wanted to see a faithful retelling of the story of the graphic novels, but as episode 1, which is largely faithful to the book, was playing out, I kept thinking, why does this feel so hollow? Did we actually need to see this story again? It's honestly why I don't have any patience for the people who are throwing a fit about these changes. Episode 1 is without a doubt the worst of the series. The show didn't take off, so to speak, until Scott did. And while I understand being a little upset that Scott is only heavily featured in 3 out of 8 episodes, the show is still about Scott. With him at the center of Ramona's investigation, we learn a ton about him and his relationships through this narrative. And it isn't just a retread, it's an examination of the same characters, themes, and ideas from a new angle, and that is so damn refreshing. I cannot relate to people who want the same narratives regurgitated and delivered in new forms over and over and over again. The graphic novels are excellent. The movie is excellent. They also already exist, and anyone can enjoy them. They're out there. Instead, we get a new Scott Pilgrim story from the creator of Scott Pilgrim. A story that allows expansion on characters who didn't get as much screen time previously, one that allows the narrative to evolve and investigate itself in a new way, and we were given something that potentially offers a brighter future for not just Scott himself, but for the franchise. One of my favorite things about this series is specifically that characters who did not get a spotlight previously are featured heavily, with one of the best and most prominent examples being Matthew Patel. In both the books and movie, Patel shows up and is eliminated pretty quickly. We get the same basic backstory with Ramona, but not much else. But once Patel beats Scott, damn does he rise to the occasion. The second episode is ingenious, showing the natural progression of what we'd see if it was proven that Gideon's entire scheme makes no sense. Patel beats Scott, but of course Ramona isn't going to give him the time of day. She's not just going to drop everything and date him now. There's ultimately nothing in it for these evil exes, and so Patel calls Gideon out on this. With that newfound confidence, he literally defeats Gideon and takes over his entire empire.
This is my league now. I'm the main character.
Here's to the new boss.
He even ends up living out his childhood dreams of performing on stage, hilariously as Scott Pilgrim in a musical. The way this series turns the entire world on its head is so much fun, and I love the way it approaches these characters from new angles. Roxy is another of my favorite examples of this. In the film, Roxy is a bit one-dimensional, clearly still showing resentment towards Ramona. The books give us a bit more insight into the nature of their relationship. The pair are friendly and on speaking terms, though the resentment is clearly still there. Roxy essentially chastises Ramona the majority of the time they're on the page together, but we don't get a ton of insight into the actual nature of their breakup or their previous relationship, and if they do have any sort of reconciliation, it's not shown, though it could have happened while Roxy was staying with Ramona later in book 4. But the series takes a more explicit look at that relationship and why Roxy clearly held that resentment towards Ramona. I love that the series gives them the space not just to showcase an incredible and inspired fight, but actually unpack those feelings of resentment.
You made me feel like nothing. You were afraid. Good for you. All I wanted was for you to see me.
I love the way this series takes the time to explore these characters who get limited screen and page time in the previous iterations. While the movie doesn't quite give the room to explore Ramona's own mistakes in her past relationship, that's definitely a more important aspect of the books, overcoming her own insecurities and shortcomings in her love life. But even with that being an important aspect of the graphic novels, this series is able to focus on it more wholly, in the same way that the graphic novels are able to unpack those things for Scott himself. I also really enjoyed how the series handled Lucas Lee. This definitely feels like a character where they sort of met in the middle in regards to his graphic novel and movie characterizations. The book sort of fakes out the idea that he's an asshole, only to reveal that he's actually pretty chill. The movie really embraces Chris Evans' amazing ability to be a cocky dickhead, one of the funniest performances in the film.
Lucas, between your string of box office bombs and reports of your toxic skater boy behavior, this town's on the verge of saying, "See you later, boy."
But the show also slightly subverts those expectations, making it seem like he's partying and continuing that movie star behavior, when really he's actually staying focused and learning his lines. Though, once again, the more thorough exploration of Lucas and his relationship with Ramona is the real sauce here. The added context that makes these exes more three-dimensional, diving into how Ramona leaving actually made them feel.
The best skater, the highest paid actor, the biggest star. That day made me who I am. So I guess, in a way, I have to thank you, Ramona.
I just find this so much more compelling than giving us the stories we've already seen play out. A supplementary AU that dives deeper into the aspects of the world we haven't otherwise seen. Though obviously not everyone gets a deeper exploration than they got in the comics. Some get a bit less focus, which I think is forgivable. It's more about spreading the development and exploring the characters from new angles. Sadly, Envy is a character who was a bit shafted in both the film version and now the series, though she definitely gets iconic moments in each. I mean, the Clash at Demon Head concert is arguably the most iconic moment in the film, and she gets another great concert moment at Scott's funeral in this. But the graphic novels remain the place where Envy is explored the most thoroughly. But again, I think this works fine. They do a great job utilizing characters in fun new ways, even if their exploration isn't as thorough. The Wallace and Todd subplot is a perfect example of this. There's an entire B-plot where Todd starts cheating on Envy with Wallace, even falling in love with him, only for Wallace to completely discard him.
When the movie ends, so does the relationship. Tale as old as time.
You don't
love me?
But while this story isn't really a deeper dive into either character, it intertwines both of their stories from the comics and movie and pieces it together in a hilarious new storyline. In both other iterations, Wallace is shown to chase straight dudes and succeed in seducing them. In the comics, Todd is explicitly cheating on Envy with their drummer, so this is just a perfect way to combine these two stories into something funny and new for Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Sadly, other characters who don't get a ton to do are the Katyanagi twins, though they definitely get a bit more than they did in the film, which was close to nothing. But if I'm being honest, these are probably the least explored Evil X's across all iterations of Scott Pilgrim. We do at least get a bit into their past with Ramona and how she basically two-timed both of them, seeing them both at the same time. But these are characters I'd really love to see more of in future Scott Pilgrim projects, if we ever get any. But one character who gets to shine in Takes Off is Knives Chow. She's always been a fan favorite character, and she's great in both the movie and the books, but I love this alternate journey for Knives. One that isn't as focused on obsessing over Scott, one where his demise ends up leading her down a path of self-discovery. In Scott's absence, Knives decides to try and pick up bass and discovers she's an absolute natural. She ends up teaming up with Stephen Stills and leaning fully into her musical talents. I love this because in the other iterations, she sort of takes on the groupie role, following bands obsessively, but never entertaining the idea that it's something she should pursue. Using Scott's death as a catalyst for her to just try picking up an instrument is perfect. Plus, it sort of fast-tracks her friendship with Stephen Stills, which becomes more of a thing later in the books. But more importantly, it fast-tracks Knives' journey of self-actualization, one that also doesn't come until late in the book series, and barely at all in the movie. Knives finding something else in her life to focus on, realizing that a teenage crush isn't the end-all be-all, realizing that she has so much more to offer the world, and such a breadth of life to experience still. Yeah, there's pain and hurt in what happened with Scott, but he's just some guy, and she's able to move on. I particularly loved this line. I think it sums up her complicated feelings perfectly.
Scott, I'm glad you're alive. But I'm also glad you died. It gave me a lot of space to reflect and grow.
Not only do I love this as a summation of Knives' journey in Takes Off, but I also get a sense that there's a bit of a metatextual meaning here from Brian O'Malley, that there's a lot of excitement now that Scott Pilgrim is back in this new form, but also an appreciation that it stayed dead for so many years before it returned. And I think a lot of the stories in this season show his reflection and growth as a person since he first wrote the initial graphic novel back in his 20s. One character I'm a tad on the fence about here is Gideon, but I actually think his story brings up some interesting philosophical questions. After he loses everything to Matthew, we learn that Gideon is actually a dork from Canada named Gordon Goose, which I love because Gideon is sort of a dork. He doesn't get a ton of development in either the book or movie, but I absolutely get the sense that this guy was overcompensating for a dorky childhood. That totally tracks for me. They also reveal that his high school girlfriend was Julie, which, while maybe feeling a bit too coincidental, is absolutely a great pairing. But what I find interesting is that while the books and movie have Gideon doing some pretty heinous shit, the show mostly just has him start the league. It doesn't seem like he's really gone through with many of his other more evil plans that we see in the other versions. And then it further explores him as just a dude, hanging with Lucas and being bros, which are super fun sequences. But I guess it begs the question, should the show have interrogated Gideon's actions in alternate timelines more? Or since he hadn't really gone through with those things, should he be treated as though he's pure evil simply because he has the capacity to do those things, even if this version hasn't done those things? I don't know, I just found it to be an interesting question in the context of these series. One of my favorite things about Takes Off is the ways it almost plays out in conversation with the books and the movie. It's clear that this series is its own thing, its own timeline even before the literal timeline shift within the narrative, and it allows them to reevaluate and remix ideas from the other versions of the story in entirely new ways. Some of these things are genuinely just for fun, like the Scott Pilgrim screenplay and ill-fated movie attempt. For one, the idea that Lucas and Todd end up playing Scott in the movie is so funny, but it also gives us hilarious self-referential lines like this one.
No, there's a Lucas Lee character, and Scott tricks him into grinding to death. I'd never fall for that. What kind of idiot would write this?
One of the most iconic jokes in both the book and the movie is, of course,
Bread makes you fat?
Scott Pilgrim Takes Off makes this an entire song for the Scott Pilgrim musical, written by Stephen and Knives. I loved what Ben David Grabinski had to say about remixing old jokes in Takes Off. That was a rule that Brian and I had from the beginning. We didn't want to repeat any jokes from the movie and risk doing them worse, but we did want to do callbacks. So that's actually hilarious in a different way. And again, it's something that further cements my belief that this story works best in conjunction with the books and movie. movie. It feels like you're going to get a lot more out of this show, not only if you're familiar with the jokes, but with the characters and the themes and even the cultural reaction. And I think the person the story absolutely serves the best is Ramona Flowers. I understand that people can be upset that this feels like a bait and switch, especially with Scott mostly only being present in 3 episodes. But we have 6 books and a feature-length film that give Scott the spotlight, the Scottlight. And one of the biggest cultural reactions to Scott Pilgrim is the perpetuation of the manic pixie dream girl ideal. Ramona is like ground zero for an entire generation of dudes pining after manic pixie dream girls. What's so smart about this project is that it explores so many of the same themes while also flipping that aspect of the narrative on its head and giving Ramona the agency this time around. But beyond the metatextual aspect, the big hook/twist also gives the character something she has never quite experienced, and it's the perfect jumping off point for her own journey of self-reflection. Ramona doesn't have the most positive tendencies in her dating life, and while the movie and books interrogate this a little bit, the series does it much more thoroughly. She tends to be the one always making the decisions in regards to these relationships, and particularly when and how they end, often to the detriment of the other person's well-being. In Takes Off, Ramona has this one single date with Scott, and it's not like the pair fall in love in that short amount of time or anything, but they experience sparks. There's a chemistry they both feel that is undeniable, and when Scott is seemingly taken out by Matthew Patel, Ramona is denied control over how that relationship ended, something she has not experienced before, and it's what drives her on her Columbo investigation to figure out what the heck happened to Scott. It's not like she knows Scott is the love of her life, and that's why she needs to find him again. For the first time in her dating life, she's asking, what if? Scott is a huge question mark. It's the what could have been that motivates her, because she does not know. And by being confronted with this concept, she has to reconcile with the fact that she has also been the question mark for multiple people in her dating life. It's a different path to self-reflection through the same characters, and it rules. And while Scott certainly gets less of a focus, which does make a lot of Scott stans real upset, he is still going through a real character journey here. These stories have always been about Scott having to face himself and reconcile with his own insecurities and shortcomings, and in Takes Off, he is literally confronted by himself. It's basically a time travel remix of Nega Scott in the comic book. In Scott Pilgrim's finest hour, in his deepest pit of despair, Scott wants to destroy his nega self so that he can forget Ramona and move on, only for him to realize that he can't forget her because he'll continue to make the same mistakes over and over again if he does forget. That is exactly what's happening with old Scott in Takes Off. His entire plan was to time travel back and stop himself from ever dating Ramona. His pain and hurt made him want to completely erase it from the timeline. And I guess you can be mad that he learned this in the books and is now learning it again, but 1, this clearly isn't the exact same timeline as the books, and 2, if you aren't very young still, you should probably realize that people continue to struggle with their flaws and insecurities even after they confront them. Growth isn't a switch you flip. Either way, this show is exploring the same ideas as the books in an entirely new and subversive way, and it rules. And though this timeline contains a Scott who spends 14 years absolutely blowing it, the ending is still positive and optimistic in the same way that the end of the book is. Ramona reflects on her tendencies and grows as a person, and young Scott learns from a version of himself that he doesn't want to become, and even old Scott is given a hopeful ending.
Ooh, kick his ass, Super Ramona!
No. It's never too late to clean up a mess.
Man, I just cannot express how much I adore Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. It is so rare that any media is allowed to surprise us anymore. I understand when there are expectations foisted upon something and those expectations aren't met, but I truly feel so bad for the people who won't allow themselves to be taken on an unexpected journey because they wanted to be given the same story for a 3rd time. I adore the Scott Pilgrim franchise, and this show made me fall back in love with it in a way that I never knew was possible. A narrative that has grown and evolved with its audience, some of its audience at least. If this had been a faithful retelling of the books, I would have probably thought, oh cool, this is a nostalgic experience that makes me reflect on my college years. Instead, I got something that was more challenging and exciting, something that delivered an entirely new Scott Pilgrim experience that builds on the previous one, something in a franchise that genuinely surprised me, which is nearly impossible these days. It's the perfect rejection of modern reboot culture, and the story that I didn't know I needed. I personally am so glad that Scott Pilgrim took off.
Johnny Two Cellos. I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.